Okay, great. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. This is like the deathly hour where everyone's spirits are flagging. I have candies up here if anyone needs a little sustenance, but we are going to keep it lively. For instance, we are not doing the 5-minute opening talks. Okay, this is going to be a conversation. And you have been already set up for this conversation because you have heard all of the great panels this morning. So hopefully we don't have to just introduce you to every concept. So we are going to assume that you understand the harms of an algorithmically mediated public sphere that can engender the widespread distribution of propaganda, micro-targeting, echo chambers, radicalization, scams, frauds, all of which are just fancy ways of saying preying on people's vulnerabilities at scale. So this panel is really about how do we deal with this, right? We're now at a point where when I started writing about these harms, I have to put some numbers on this, 20 years ago. um, I had to prove the case to the public that there was something to be worried about here. And I think now what is great is we're in a position where I think most people sort of accept, even if they don't understand all of the details, that there are harms here and we need to mitigate them. And so we have three people on this panel who really are thinking really deeply and creatively about different types of interventions, what could work. And so I think it's a really great moment, sort of like, think of this panel like a candy, like the candies in here that I'm happy to share with all of you. Um, a little bit of sweetness. We're going to talk about how the world could be better. So we're going to envision the ways that everyone here has been doing experiments, testing. What are the ways we could improve things? So I'm going to start with you, Josh. You have you did a giant study measuring the effects of switching from Facebook and Instagram's normal engagement feed to a chronological feed. And I want you to tell us what you learned, but I just realized I didn't do my disclosure. I'm a journalist, so I basically don't make any money, so that's cool. And then also, no, I write for the New York Times. I have a little nonprofit that's funded by a bunch of foundations. I think that's it. Yeah. So, I'm a Harvard fellow. They pay me also $3. So, Josh.
All right. So disclosures, I am a professor at NYU. I co-direct the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, which is funded by a bunch of foundations, some of whom are in this room here today. We have received money we received recently a Google research grant, actually, to do a follow-up experiment about an intervention. And I have been, for the last 5 years now, going on more, the co-chair of the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study, in which I work collaboratively with researchers at Meta on the project I'm about to tell you on many papers, but including this paper that I'm about to tell you about now. As part of that project, we were not compensated financially for it, but Facebook funded the costs of the study. And of course, we got access to data that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. Earlier in my career, I was a co-PI on a Facebook research grant. And even earlier than that, I once received a very small administrative fee from Facebook for helping to organize a collaborative meeting between academics and researchers at Facebook to compensate me for my administrative time on putting that together. And I work as a senior geopolitical risk advisor for a risk consultancy called Kroll. Okay. So the paper that's out of the way. The question, Julia, your question to start with about one of these papers from this US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. So this was a kind of first of its kind, large scale collaboration. I had the incredible opportunity of a lifetime, along with Professor Talia Stroud of the UT Austin, to co-chair an amazing team of external academics, 17 of us in total, that work collaboratively with researchers at Meta to design and implement a whole series of studies about the role of Facebook and Instagram in the context of the US 2020 elections. The goal of this was that we came out of 2016, when we were here at the 2019 Stigler Conference, for example, with all sorts of unanswered questions and expectations and thoughts about the impact of Facebook in particular, but social media in general, on the outcome of the 2016 US elections. And the goal of this was to know much more about 2020 and the aftermath, and to advance scientific understanding of the relationship between social media and the elections in the context of the US election. The study has many papers associated with it. There were all sorts of, I don't want to take too much time introducing here. There were also, I wanted to say very briefly, we were super cognizant of the fact that we were talking about COI and declarations of interest here, that we were working with researchers at the platform who were paid by that platform, that we were trying to study the impact of that platform. So there's all sorts of integrity provisions that we put in place, including pre-registrations of designs, no pre-publication approval by the platforms, which was a red line for the researchers. We wouldn't have done it without that. We didn't take any money. And then also, crucially, as each paper is published, all of the data is placed in an archive where researchers can access it for replication and extension purposes. And that archive is not controlled by Meta. It's held at the University of Michigan's ICPSR in their new SOMAR, the social media archive repository there. The study itself consisted of, there were a number of papers that were observational papers. There were papers that were experimental papers, and there were some that combined both. 6 of these have been published already. There'll be another 2 coming out really soon. We've got another 2 that are sort of deep into the R&R process, another few that are under review, and then a few more stragglers that we're hoping to finish up in the next year or so. The one that you've asked about, Julia, here, which has to do with trying to understand the impact of the algorithm. So for the experiments, we tried to hit on what were big topic, scientific, and popular explanations, for going back to Julia's introduction, about harms, potential candidates for producing harms that we find online from social media. So in one paper, we explored the role of echo chambers. In another paper, we explored the role of the fact that that social media content could go viral. In this particular paper, we tried to tackle the algorithm. So what we did for the study was we took about 20,000 people, and 10,000 of them for 3 months over the course of the US 2020 election, so 2 months before the election, 1 month after the election, were randomly assigned to be put into, instead of the algorithm that was in place at the time of the US 2020 election that was governing the feed, that's what the control group saw, what had the same algorithm that was governing the content all of you were seeing on Facebook or Instagram at the time of the election. This treatment group was placed into reverse chronological feed. Now, the question, and we'll get into this in this panel, the question of why we chose reverse chronological feed, you can't run an experiment without a control group. So if we were going to try to measure the effect of the algorithm in place, we needed a compared to what. And the reason we chose reverse chronological feed was sort of threefold. One was, that's kind of the history of these social media platforms. And what reverse chronological feed just simply means, the people you're friends with on the platform, or the groups you've joined, or the pages you've followed, you get the most recent content that someone in that category has posted out of the possible inventory. And so that's how these things started. When you were first on Twitter, that's what you saw. When you were first on Facebook, that's what you saw. The second reason we chose it was because it's very simple, and it's simple to explain to people. And the third reason was because it was being discussed as a possible policy solution, right? People had brought up the idea of going back to reverse chronological feed, away from what was in place at the time on the platforms, is what we would call an individual engagement maximizing algorithm. So this reverse chronological feed that was showing people the most recent content had been replaced by an algorithm that was trying to maximize the amount of attention that you would pay to this content and the time you would spend on the platform. To be clear, at the time of the 2020 election, the inventory, the things that could have appeared in your feed, were still coming from your social graph. The pages, groups, friends that you had followed, that you were followed, or on Instagram, the people that you were following, the accounts you were following. This is before the TikTokification, where we begin to move on that dimension away from your potential inventory being the social graph, into a world where the whole platform becomes your potential inventory. So that's where we were there. And then the third caveat that I want to make clear is that the fact that we did this during the election, as I explained a second ago, is a feature of the study, not a bug. We were trying to understand what was happening during the election because we didn't want to be in the position of 2016. However, it raises questions for generalizability beyond the electoral period, because we know that Meta was doing different things during the election, in particular what is now known as some of the break the glass measures that were put into place, that it was doing at other periods of time. And of course, it's time bound. It's bound by a single country. It's bound by a single election. But what we found in that particular case was quite surprising. And at the highest level, what we found was, not surprisingly, big changes to people's on-platform experience, But for all of the sort of downstream potential harms online that we were concerned about and other things that were not harms that we were concerned about, we found null effects off platform in the sort of behavioral realm. So we found no impact on levels of polarization, either issue level polarization or affective polarization. We found no effect on people's belief in the legitimacy of the election. We found no effect on people's participation in the election. We did, however, find numerous effects, which we could go into later, and things that changed their on-platform experience. The most noticeable one, that's interesting that I'll just say, is that we did find that people were less likely to use the platform when they were put back into reverse chronological feed, which makes sense. If what's in place is an engagement maximizing, you would assume if you get rid of that, you should have less engagement. But the follow-up to that was interesting, because the people who then used Facebook less, they were more likely to use Instagram. The people who were in our Instagram study who got put into our reverse chronological feed, they were more likely to use TikTok. There were lots of other on-platform developments we can talk about if you're interested, but that's the major takeaway from this. And it was quite, in a sense, when we pre-registered all these experiments we were going to run and we found no sort of heterogeneous treatment effects or anything along those lines, the expectation wasn't that we were going to get a whole bunch of nulls out of this, but these were because of the size of the experiment with 20,000 people in it, by the way, consenting participants, who were also compensated for their participation. These are very precisely powered nulls, so they're very, very highly estimated, very precisely estimated, way beyond the scale of what we've been able to do previously.
Thank you. I think that it really is an interesting finding. I think null findings are really interesting. And by the way, just as a side note, as a journalist, I have always wanted to find a way to write about null results that I've found as a journalist, but it's harder to do in journalism because it's like, what kind of story is that? Like, I didn't find anything, but I thought you might be interested. But I love that you can do it in academia, and I think it is actually valuable information. And I think in particular in this case, the last panel was on DSA, and in the DSA there is a requirement, I believe, that the very large online platforms have to offer a chronological feed in addition to the engagement, because there's a policy idea out there, which I believe you were testing, that it was the alternative, that users should have an alternative. And I think my personal view, and I've written about this before, is that I think that that's a false choice. There's obviously things in between the reverse chronological feed and the totally engagement focused feed. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about whether you agree with that false choice and whether there's some more information we need to learn on the in between, which will then lead into Laura's work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when we set out to do this study, we kind of had two goals in mind. The first goal, as what I told you about, was we wanted to make sure that after 2020, we didn't have all these questions like we did with 2016 and not know what the answers to those questions were. And in that case, I think this project has been an unmitigated success. We will know much, much more about the 2024 elections. We already know about Facebook and Instagram's role in it than we did about 2016, the 2020 election, than we did about 2016, and sadly, than we do about 2024. But the second goal of this was to be a model. Like in apropos the previous panel, the DSA panel, we wanted to show people that this was possible, that you could do, you can't do this research of experimental studies changing people's algorithmic exposure on the platform without cooperating with the platforms. They have to implement the studies. And we wanted to show that it was possible to do this in a rigorous, scientific manner that would survive peer review scrutiny and would be judged by the research policy public as legitimate understanding of what happens on these platforms. But the idea always was that hopefully other platforms would pick up on this and that they would say, hey, there's all these rumors floating around out there. We can actually, for, pocket change for these platforms, we can actually support these kinds of studies, and people can learn more about the impact of our platforms, and we can improve kind of scientific knowledge. That hasn't really happened, right? We haven't seen anybody sort of pick up on this. And this goes to Julia's point, which is that when I give the long talk on this, I have a slide that's all the caveats about this, about what we can generalize off of this. It was super interesting research, but we don't know even about reverse chronological feed if we would find something different in a multi-party system, right? We don't know if we would find something different in the US in an off-election year as opposed to during a presidential election year. There's lots of things we don't know. We changed each of these functions of the algorithm individually and did 3 separate studies, but what if we had done all of them at once, right? Would that have made a difference? And then Julia, you raised that. So that's just all to put context on this question, that for this particular study, any of these studies, you have to make research designs choices. And we needed a control group, right? And so we used reverse chronological feed. I still think it's the best thing that I could come here to you and defend today, as if we had this one-shot deal to look at the algorithm, this is what we should be controlling it for. But yeah, absolutely. There's kind of exciting work being done. My postdoc at the Center for Social Media and Politics, Kylan Rutherford, has been involved with this when he was a PhD student at Columbia, but also Jonathan Stray at UC Berkeley have been running this sort of pro-social challenge. And lots of other people are trying to think about more pro-social algorithms. So if you want to think about, like, if you buy that the sort of generic control is reverse chronological feed, that's the closest thing we have to a kind of baseline, there are lots of other things that we can try out there. And the key to this is going to be able to be to advancing scientific knowledge, but also to getting good policy, is going to be trying to be able to run these kinds of studies again and again. And I think that's where we are right now. I absolutely 100% agree. This isn't the last word on this in the slightest. This is the first word, but I think it gives us a path by which these kind of studies can be done.
Thank you for putting in the first word. And Laura will bring us the second word, because she has been developing a taxonomy of algorithmic feed design. Okay, I'm already messing up what you're doing, but please tell us how you are trying to make this array of choices that we have somewhere between reverse chronological and engagement comprehensible and understandable.
Sure thing. And yeah, what I've been trying to develop for the last couple of years is really a taxonomy of feed algorithms themselves. So these are some slides from a larger work that I did with Frances Haugen and Damon McCoy. So there's going to be some cars in it, but we don't really have time to get into that. So the first thing that I really need to do is just explain how feed recommendation works. It's a 3-stage process. The first thing that happens is that the content inventory that is even like eligible to be shown to a user has to be sifted out from like the billion items that exist on a platform. So first we pull some small pool, then we're going to rank those individual items in that pool, and then we're going to assemble the final feed. And to take you through those 3 stages, when we identify that small pool of maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of items. Remember, there's a wide range of ways we can do that, but the fundamental task here is we just need to get from like 1 billion items to maybe 10,000. So once we do that, then we can rank those items. So we'll have some kind of objective function. And this is where really the feeds, what the feed is trying to accomplish, like the feed values, really start to get encoded. And so, for example, I might have a function where I might make a prediction about the likelihood of the user commenting on something, the likelihood that they might click a reaction like a like. And then I might also make a prediction around maybe, how likely are they to end their session if I show them this thing. And then I add all these together into a into a function. And then I'm going to assemble the final feed. And this final feed assembly, you might think that it's just, rank them from whichever one has the highest number to whichever one has the lowest number. But it doesn't quite work that way, because I might have other kind of larger goals for what I want the user to do. So maybe I need to have that user discover things that they're not interested in now, so that I can continue to feed them new things. That's novelty. So to do that, I might introduce things that I have where I really don't have any knowledge about, that they might like something or not. So I might insert some things in here that are just totally foreign to them. And I might have other kinds of goals, like ads get inserted here, or if I have some business objective of some other thing that I want to show them, like heating, that all happens here. Okay, so those are that's the basic flow. So inventory selection, that first phase, I said, we're just going from 1 billion items to maybe 10,000. I can source content a few different ways. There's directly connected content and indirectly connected content. This is something the user has sent a direct signal about, or something that's related to a direct signal. So this is like following something, following a page, a friend, indicating that you're interested in a topic, that kind of thing. And then there's unconnected content. That's everything else. So, I also talked about that ranking phase and that feed assembly phase. All of those two parts of the system together, they create feeds. They have certain characteristics. And there are 4 of them, and I go through them in turn. The first is intensity. So platforms that try to maximize for engagement, and this is the thing most people know about, because many of the classic algorithms, like the Facebook algorithm, the Instagram algorithm, Twitter's algorithm, all these algorithms are high engagement. They are trying to get the user to not just like look at something, but to interact with it, to comment on it, to click on a video, to react to it. This is highly interactive content. The other end of this, low intensity engagement, this is engagement that is not as interactive, but will go on for longer. So this is duration based algorithms. And the thing is that you might think like, well, can I have both? And the answer is no. This is a hard trade-off. Platforms will try to find some sweet spot in the middle, but they tend to be more toward the engagement side or more toward the duration side. And the reason that they're a trade-off is that for things that are really engaging, things that are really intense, they also have a higher likelihood of causing the user to end the session. So if you think about a platform like YouTube that has a very high duration algorithm, there are people who just they leave YouTube on in the background of their life and they play it for 8 hours a day. Those people are not clicking on, they're not reacting to every video. They're not commenting. And that is a duration-based low intensity algorithm. The next characteristic is super simple. It's timeliness. Algorithms can either prioritize content that is very recent, or they can not really care, and they can show content that is, maybe they'll show you an item that's 3 years old, then they'll show you something that's 3 days old, then they'll show you something that's 6 months old. So platforms like Pinterest they have no concept of timeliness. They're very low timeliness, high timeliness things like Twitter, which are really for breaking news. Okay, novelty. So some platforms, TikTok really is chief among them, have an explicit user promise that I'm going to introduce you to new things, to things that you have not seen before. These platforms have to be tolerant of things that users might not like, because when you introduce new things, most of the time users don't like them. There's a reason they had never interacted with that stuff before. And so, there are many platforms that I would say most platforms tend toward the low novelty side. They give you just the stuff that they know that you like. And then the last characteristic that I'm going to talk about is specificity. Platforms can try to identify a small number of items that everyone will like. Kittens. Nobody hates kittens. Everyone will watch kittens for a few minutes. I don't know, Alyssa, she's a real cat hater over there, but
I see a cat hater in the back.
I'm super allergic to cats. I just want to kick them whenever I see them, but go ahead.
Other platforms, and YouTube, I think, in their documentation, they describe this really clearly. They don't just want to find the content that you love. For any piece of content that they're going to recommend, they want to find the people who really love that content. And this creates some really big differences in the overall distribution of attention over that information ecosystem, because high specificity platforms tend to have just much flatter distributions of attention. So there's a lot of things that go a little bit viral. Whereas low specificity platforms, they have 3 things and everybody on the platform sees them. And so we put all of these characteristics together in what we call a feed card or a window sticker for feed algorithms. And this is sort of intended as a visual that is comparable and might actually convey all of these characteristics in a way that a user could understand. So that's everything I know about feed algorithms.
Amazing. I love it. So this is, imagine if we actually knew this, right? We intuit this about our algorithms. You've read the documentation, but the truth is we don't no one is actually disclosing, right, their actual.
Well, maybe I should just mention very briefly how we built this. So all of the data I've presented today, all the information, this comes from company documentation, patents, leaked documents. The Facebook files are actually tremendously helpful in doing this for Facebook. There's leaked documents for most platforms, so I'll tell you, and academic papers, because actually a lot of this stuff does come out in a variety of ways. The one platform that we were able to get really precise about was Twitter, because one of the first things that Elon Musk did is he open sourced most of Heavy Ranker, and so for X, we were able to just go look at the code, and that was very, very helpful for that. For the other platforms, it's a little squishier.
Right. But I think it's amazing, and I would love to have this ranking available on all of my algorithms. And I would also like to choose my algorithms based on this. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about the recommendation from Alyssa's group. Alyssa, her institute has just come out with this report on how we could build better feeds, basically with a lot of former executives from the companies who build these feeds, who are now in academia, have come together and sort of build this idea of what would it look like to build feeds that were more pro-social, that were not just focused on engagement and sort of catching us in that sort of watching a car wreck mentality, which is what I think a lot of people view the harms of these algorithms to be. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how your work fits into that, or if we should just we can also throw it to Alyssa.
Well, so I think what is so great about the recommendations that the KGI developed is they really pull together everything we know, the best science, and sort of what recommendations we can take from that. And absolutely, I think a very sensible recommendation, something that we know, is that it does genuinely appear that engagement maximizing high intensity algorithms do seem to be associated with a wide range of harms. I think what's difficult and something that gives me a lot of pause is we don't necessarily know how to change things to make them better. And I'll say this is a concern that I have about low intensity duration based algorithms is a hypothesis I am very interested in testing is whether low intensity, high duration algorithms are associated with social media addiction. Social media addiction is not a diagnosed thing, but certainly quite a few people seem to have problematic use with social media, and at least anecdotally, looking at reports from users who experience this, the same platforms always come up as the platforms that are folks' gateway to social media addiction, and they tend to be platforms that have low intensity, high duration algorithms,
Which is YouTube.
And TikTok.
Yeah.
Yes, super quick two finger. Just on this, like not knowing what's going to be the implications until you actually do the research. So another one of the papers that's come out already was about virality. And so for that one, we got rid of reshares. That was our attempt to have a treatment condition where, again, the control condition had the normal algorithm, but the treatment condition didn't see anything that was reshared, right? So if Laura and I are friends and Laura posts something and I see it, but if I reshare it, Julia, you're my friend, you're not going to see it. And that was a treatment group. Anyway, that was a treatment group. And so in that particular case, what we found was that did reduce people's exposure to content that had been flagged by Meta's third-party fact-checker program as being misinformation. So it reduces exposure to misinformation, but it also reduced exposure to news, right? And so you go after this thinking, oh, we're going to try to target one thing that we might be causing harm. But these things, until you actually do this and you see what the implications are when you make these changes to these algorithms, you don't know what other spillover effects it's going to have in this particular case. So I just want to, there's loads of examples of like that in the papers if you want to go check them out. But
Which is why it's so helpful that the platforms are limiting researcher access to their data. Because we need access to do those types of intervention studies.
Oh, I just realized I didn't do my disclosures.
Oh yeah, do.
I was employed by the Department of Justice. I have been a consultant for the Department of Justice. I'm currently an assistant professor at Northeastern University, part of the great American cartel that is academia. I don't, my research is primarily funded by foundations, but I do not take money from tech platforms because I study them, nor do I take any kind of privileged access to data. Yeah, I never have.
Thank you. Okay, Paul. So we're going to transition to AI because seems like it's kind of big these days, I hear. And people are not necessarily as much reliant on their feeds, and they're turning towards AI for answers. I spent last year testing AI for the accuracy of its answers to election queries about really basic things. Where should I go vote if in my zip code? And it was pretty terrible, all of them, at answering those questions, which was really disappointing. I did the testing throughout the full year and did not see improvement either in any of the leading AI models. So, Paul, you've been looking at how can we, what is the best way for regulators to intervene in making AI better? How can we create a world where it is incentivized to provide accurate answers? Because right now there's no cost to them if I go to the wrong polling place because they told me to go to the wrong polling place. So do your disclosures and then tell us about AI.
About 10 years ago, I gave a talk on the corrupting influence of corporate money in academic research at a company. And then I was silently never invited back to that company. So I really applaud the Stigler Center on kind of the way they're leaning into these disclosures. I work for Georgetown. I'm a professor in the law school. Most of my research these days are funded by two Georgetown programs, the Fritz Family Fellowship and something called the McCourt School Tech and Public Policy Program. McCourt is Frank McCourt, who I disagree with fundamentally on just about everything he says about tech policy, but I do enjoy spending his money. Okay. I'm also a recidivist government regulator, so I've worked for the Justice Department, the Federal Trade Commission, and I think I'm currently employed by the Colorado Attorney General. I helped them write privacy rules 2 years ago, and it's like the mob. Once you're in, you're never out. So the first thing I'll say is I actually don't write much about social media and harms of social media. And so in a funny way, I'm an interloper, but I'm fascinated by the work of these fine scholars. I'm also unburdened by things like peer review and empiricism and rigor. So if it's okay with Julia, let me say really quick hit things about the talks we just heard. And then I think in a way, what I'm trying to do is have the AI intervention where I say, I'm a little worried that this work is really important, but will be less important over time. So my three quick hits really, really quickly is I'm just frustrated that we're still with these giant platforms where millions of people can talk to millions of people and there's no real business model around community. And so I have written, the one little thing I wrote was in a book called The Barons and the Mob by James Grimmelman and Charles Dewan. And my contribution highlighted subreddits and podcasts as these funny places with community identity and social norms and moderators and expectations. And so why don't we just get rid of the big platforms altogether? And it's funny to say subreddits as the shining example of civilized discourse, but I often very much feel that way. Number two, I was talking to Laura about this earlier today. We're about to have this wonderful natural experiment when the Court of Justice for the European Union basically tells Meta you are no longer allowed to use personalized advertising. And I think that's where we're headed. And so I hope you're both measuring exactly what that does to engagement. And then number three, and Julia has written a lot more about this than I have, I hope and think what that's going to expose is the surveillance society we built on the back of personalized advertising is actually terrible for advertisers and terrible for publishers. And so it's primarily been used to buck up the business model of ad tech. And they're fine people who I think will find other jobs once their industry disappears. Okay. But in a way, I have leaned fully into the kind of AI revolution. I realize I've written, 10 articles on machine learning, and I am a erstwhile computer scientist. But I didn't consider myself an AI law scholar until 2 years ago. And now I'm writing a textbook on it, and I teach a class of 100 students. And so I think a lot about the kind of machinery of these large models, and in particular, the large language models. I do completely agree with Julia's framing. which is, in a sense, people are going to learn to rely more on things like ChatGPT or Companion AI or Claude or whatever comes next. And in a sense, maybe break free from the shackles of the algorithmic feed because they're going to get their information in their community and everything else through the algorithms. And I hope you can hear me say that without thinking, oh, here's another AI nut job who has drank the Kool-Aid. I actually fundamentally believe something really different and important happened with the advent of large language models. I do think there was a step increase in power. I think it surprised experts, but I hope you can hear me believing all of that without saying, Terminator is right around the corner. But because of that, I've been hanging out with a lot of computer scientists to really learn about how these technologies are shaped, questions like interpretability and are there fundamental limits on what we can know about them. And so maybe I'll tease a few things and we'll see if in Q&A any of you want me to elaborate on these. The number one takeaway is it's astonishing how a large language model can be changed in fundamental ways with very little effort, very little input, very little money, and very little time, right? These may be the most malleable artifacts of industrial production in the history of the world. See, unburdened by peer review, I can say things like that. And so if you compare it to like telling someone to change the railways or change the telephone network, right? Or change the electrical grid, we're talking about micro pennies on the dollar for fundamental changes that and the we is a little vague. It could be the European Union. It could be a bunch of users who are really upset. It could be people inside the corporation to take a technology, a large language model based technology that does X and tomorrow make it do not X. And again, I'm happy to elaborate on that. But I want to say two things to me that flow from that. And again, I'm going to say this just to be provocative, but hopefully leave you wanting more. So one is it's never been cheaper to comply with regulation. Never in the history of the world for, an industrial actor who, has to change its operations, even with the malleability of old school software that required these things called coders, right? Changing a large language model is so cheap. And so insofar as anything like the First Amendment, or for those who are real nerds with the law, the Dormant Commerce Clause, turn on this question of, maybe we can justify the law, but only if we can justify the burden. Well, the burden calculation is going to zero really quickly, right? It's going to be hard for companies to say that these laws are burdensome at all. And again, I hope that's provocative enough that you'll push me on it, and I'll give you some examples. The second thing, and this all falls under a broad umbrella of fine-tuning, is what the techies will sometimes call what I'm describing, or part of what I'm describing. For those who haven't done it, it is astonishingly non-technical, right? You use English sentences and paragraphs to change the way a large language model works. And I don't just mean prompt engineering, which I know a lot of you have looked into. I mean, like to fundamentally change the weights and parameters of a large language model, you basically just give it a really poorly written SAT that you write yourself, and it will change the behavior of the model. And the reason I find this exciting, terrifying a little bit, but exciting, is it means for the first time in tech policy in the last 2 decades, the technologists are no longer in charge, or not by definition. That you actually could bring a broader set of humanity and a broader set of training and a broader set of people to the table to change the way the technology operates. And again, I mean that in government to company, but I also mean that within companies. Now, don't get me wrong, the technologists are still important, but
Thank you for
they're
that.
no longer at the center. And so I call this my decentering technologists, which is, I think we're giving the technologists probably what a lot of them have always wanted, which is we kind of want to be the plumbers. We don't like that the weight of Western civilization or global civilization is on our shoulders. I think we can give that to them. I'm a little worried that void is then filled by people with MBAs, but still, it might be a step in the right direction. All right.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is we actually have a chance to do our interventions to shape AI and make it serve the public interest, that policymakers don't have to fall for what they fell for in the social media world, which is 20 years of saying you don't understand its magic inside of our black box, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's still capitalism, so right. I mean, I'm not arguing that we've done away with those incentives and forces, but I am arguing that we've expanded the toolkit. I mean, Alyssa Cooper on the last panel, who for some reason has been name checked 5 times already, she talked about this design model, like thinking about how to. And the heart of my research agenda right now is who gets to design, who's at that table, who gets to decide who's at that table, and I'm very interested in how large language models might allow us to broaden who's at the design table.
Laura?
Um, just to bring up the adversarial version of what you're talking about, because I am very glad that you are bringing up the good parts of this, but there are security parts
Sure.
that we should be very concerned about. And you are absolutely correct. It is very easy to adapt and fine tune large language models. And the problem with this is that it is very easy for an adversary to do that in a way that is difficult to detect. And it's very easy for a censoring country to do this. There was a story that came out in TechCrunch a couple of weeks ago where we actually got a leak of some of the data sets that are used to train Chinese models with, like, here's all the things you have to censor. And I think what I find so difficult and so insidious about this kind of censorship or this kind of information control is how invisible it is. It is like the classic problem of covert censorship, where you don't know if the system doesn't know something or if it's been memory holed. And I think this is the only solution I know of for this problem is frankly going to be transparency. It's the same solution that I think we need to bring to bear for social media algorithms too. And that's where I sort of see a lot of the thinking about how we can make these systems serve society actually has a lot of commonality.
So Josh is actually doing some work on exactly this question. So, like, Josh, you want to jump in and
Yeah. So I'm going to start at the end and completely agree with Laura that the solution is transparency. But Laura and you guys have been talking about fine tuning, what you do after the model's there. I want to just shift the direction of this conversation a little bit to think about pre-training of the model with the training data that's going into the model. We have talked a lot, and there's been a ton of attention since ChatGPT came out to ascriptive biases that come out of these models because of training data. The most obvious ones, like you ask it to give you a picture of a doctor and it's a white male person, right, who is the doctor. Or if you train on, there's all sorts of things about ascriptive biases in these models. But one of the things that we're trying to think seriously about at our lab, and I'm doing, this is collaborative research as well with people at UCSD and Princeton and University of Oregon, is trying to think about what sort of institutional biases exist in the world that produce training data for these models. Because if you have biases in the type of data that's being used to train these models, that can translate into the output that comes out of these models. And as long as what goes into training these models is not transparent, we don't know where these biases are coming from. And this is, I think, a crucial role for scholars to be able to play here. So let me give you a couple of examples to think about here. And what I mean by kind of institutional biases. One thing to think about in terms of institutions is, for example, state-sponsored propaganda, state-controlled media in non-open, non-democratic regimes that is not behind paywalls because the people producing that want their population to read the state-controlled propaganda. Then you go to open societies where we've had this huge uproar about the fact that these large language models trained on huge corpuses of information produced by journalists. And rightly so, there's a kind of question about who owns the benefits from all of that content that's produced. But if the solution to that is that we paywall the free press and we keep open state-controlled media, what does that do to the content that comes out of these models, right? So that's one way of thinking about this sort of framework of institutions. Think about this another way. Imagine a situation where you're trying to get information from large language models about immigration policy in European countries. Well, in many European countries, you have far-right parties who all they want to talk about is immigration policy. And they are going to produce lots of information, lots of text, lots of video, lots of podcast recordings about immigration policy from a far right perspective. But if the center left and the center right doesn't really want to talk about this issue because it's not a real winning issue for them, and they want to talk about other issues, they want to talk about democracy, they want to talk about taxes, what are the models going to learn about immigration policy? And in particular, what are they going to learn when you start querying them about immigration policy in that language? What's going to come out of this? So I think this is a particularly important case. And these guys, again, talking about the fine tuning, but as an experiment, if you take, for example, an open weight model and you give it a surprisingly small level of Chinese propaganda, it immediately begins to change its answers in Chinese to begin producing more pro-CCP answers to questions about Chinese politics. And the number of documents you have to give to these large language models to get it to change in this training phase is actually remarkably small. So we have a bunch of research in this regard that's going to hopefully be coming out soon. It's currently under media embargo, so I'm going to leave the discussion of it at this level. But I think this question about institutional biases of production of training data is something that we should really, as a research community, be focusing on. And I think as a policy community, when you are thinking about what sort of transparency we want to get out of these companies that are producing these large language models, we absolutely want the transparency on the fine tuning, but we also want the transparency on what data is going into training them.
Can I quickly?
Yeah, and then we're going to Q&A.
So one really interesting thing about this, and if you're not nerding out hard on this stuff, it might have eluded you. Fundamentally, we all totally agree with the premise, which is people with access to fine tuning can really control the models, right? And so in a world where these models are going to exist, we better fight like hell to make sure that there's transparency and that we're all at the design table. But the reason China can do what both of my co-panelists have described is the very reason that, a regulator you care more about. So like in a funny way, I think we're all arguing for democratic control and less totalitarianism, which is maybe a happy place for us to agree on, because I don't think we can just wave a wand and make the large language models go away, right? As much as some of us might want to.
Okay, let's open up for questions. I think someone has a mic. We have mic runners on both sides, and up there on the right.
Hi, my name is Yana. I'm a deputy director of platforms at NBC News. And to kind of tie this back to media, what should the media be doing? We have SEO teams to try to help us understand how to get Google search traffic. We have social media teams trying to kind of figure out how to trick the algorithms on social media. And the algorithm always changes. And now should we have AI teams to figure out how to get our content in front of the audience on AI? How can the media organization stay ahead of this changing landscape and kind of make sure that the content gets out there? Or should we do it like New York Times and rely on games and recipes to kind of drive more of the funding to help kind of sustain our journalism?
Julia, you're the moderator. You should answer that question first, right?
I don't know. I feel like games and recipes. But
I have thoughts.
You have thoughts. Go for it.
So I've spent a lot of the last couple of years looking primarily at TikTok data, and in a variety of studies. But you just wind up looking at a lot of content. And one of the things that I found most striking about whenever I look at like a newsy kind of topic, I see mainstream news content doing really well on TikTok, but it's not posted by mainstream news platforms. With very few exceptions, I think like the Daily Mail is right at the top of that. I will see like CNN videos. I will see NBC videos that have been like chopped up and TikTokified by someone else who takes your content, turns it into the TikTok vernacular, and gets a lot of views. And I mean, I think that as big media companies that have survived media transitions have done in the past, taking the thing that worked on radio and translating it to television, well, it doesn't. You have to figure out the new vernacular. And I think that there are media companies, and I actually think things like Reshaping Games, that is doing a great way of meeting people where they are with They want to play with their phones. And then sometimes they're also going to look at news and headlines. That is keeping people engaged with a thing. They are playing in that ecosystem. They're following the rules of that space. And so I think that if media companies try to take what worked on television or even take what worked on the internet and apply it in a smartphone era, it's not going to work. I think they have to figure out what works on smartphones for them.
Also, by the way, I do have a paper I've written for Harvard on what traditional journalists can learn from online influencers, and actually dives a lot into exactly some of the things that we in traditional media could do more. And actually, the main finding, if you don't want to read the whole thing, is that we take our audience's trust for granted, and they work for it. Not always in good faith.
Julie, can I jump in quickly on
Yeah.
that one? Yeah, I mean, I want to say so. We want to get to a lot of questions, so I'm going to stay away from the social media, the general strategy. I want to say one thing about LLMs though, and the chatbots, because if we were having this conversation almost like a few months ago, before we got these search augmented chatbots, we would be very concerned that, like, even if the chatbots were aware of the NBC News reporting, all the things I was saying before about the importance of having high quality news included in the training data, you still wouldn't get any credit for it necessarily, because it would just spit out an answer to the question. But things have changed very recently. And sort of Perplexity was at the forefront of this, and is the platform. Perplexity's been doing it for a while, but the fact is, the matter is that the other big large language models like ChatGPT are now doing these search augment with RAG models, where you ask them a question and you can click on a button to have them search, but they're also just going out and searching. And this puts you in a conundrum, because when those search results come back from the RAG, they're coming back with citations, which I think is with links to where they got the information, which I think is a fantastic development in terms of transparency. And it makes people who are concerned about hallucinations, it gives you a very quick recourse. And if you want the quick overview, you could just read it and you can look at what the sources are. And we know from other studies that source credibility helps people assess veracity of information, but you can also click on those links. But so that's where I think things get complicated, because you have this big pushback to keep your content away from LLMs because you want your business to be monetized off of what's happening. But if you do that, your content is not going to show up. And it's almost like it's been first you had Gemini showing up inside of the Google search results, but now it's like large language models are being kind of Google-fied. There are links that people can then follow through, and you want that traffic to come to you. So I think it puts unfortunately, I wish I had a simple answer to this, but I think it makes it complicated for how legacy news media that is producing this high quality journalism is going to want to interact with these large language models in this kind of search era of the large language models that we're in right now.
And I think it's also really interesting to look at which news outlets are chosen to be linked to in those, because anecdotally, I feel like I see it's the ones that they have those licensing deals with. And so I think it almost begs the question about whether it becomes pay to play. And I think we also need transparency to answer that question. Over there.
Speaking of LLM augmented search, there's a whole conversation in the US v. Google case about the extent to which LLMs is affecting competition in the search market. I've reviewed a lot of the comments submitted to the British competition regulator, the CMA, who's actively investigating the state of the search market right now. And the industry line is that competition is white hot. You read something from industry and it's like you have the dominant player, but AI is changing everything, and the giant that's leading could be slain by Perplexity or something, right? Like, I guess I was curious to ask, like, what's your opinion of that? Like, how is AI affecting competition and search, and how does that maybe complicate the remedies conversation that's happening right now, literally in like a week or two?
I'll pass really quickly to the lawyer, but I think there was this Pew report that came out right now, and the bottom line is there's just not that many people using these LLMs yet, and there's even fewer that are using them for search, but it's early days, and that could change kind of really quickly. But there's a recent Pew report that came out about this, about percentage of people using LLMs at all regularly for acquiring news, and I think it was pretty low, but I'll pass to the lawyer.
Also, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the court considered and did not accept that argument. I mean, that was the counter argument in the Google search monopoly case, right? And they were like, nah, not really. So, I mean, we might have different feelings, but I think it has been already ruled on.
And I'm not going to come to the Stigler Center and say anything about antitrust law. Not aimed as, but I will say that, and this is sort of an obvious point, LLMs are going to be everywhere. And so this dichotomy of search versus, you already have the annoying summaries from Google, but 1 out of every 10 times, this is just me. I'm like, oh, that summary is all I needed to know. I have this deep-seated fear, like, is it accurate? But it's all I need. I'm not going to click on any links. Everyone's going to do that. It's large language models are going to be stuck inside all of these technologies. And then the two questions just, merge. So.
Next question. Where are we with our mic over there? Give it to Alyssa since
Yeah,
she was
right,
called out.
right of reply.
Yeah, poor thing. All we did
I
was
was
talk
going to
about
ask
you.
you a question about what you said. Well, first of all, I think to your point, Josh, the Department of Justice does have an answer to this, because if you look at the remedies that they proposed in the US v. Google search trial, they proposed that publishers be able to opt out of having their content included in Google's models on a model by model basis. So you could make your content available for search, but you could individually opt out of each LLM that Google ever decides to build. Who knows if that will remain in place when the judge rules? But there are approaches to that question. I was more intrigued by what I thought you proposed, Paul, which is that we potentially have this flourishing of LLMs because everybody can sort of rule their own. And I wonder how that interacts with the fact that for many of the sort of current experience that people have online is very much like a platformized experience. So you go to Google and it's you can't get to any other LLM. You can only get to Gemini. And if you're using an Apple device, you're using Siri. And if you're on WhatsApp, you're using the llama-based Meta terrifying bot. So how does that really square? Don't you expect that people will continue to be sort of stuck in these walled gardens because they because they have the network effect where you can connect to everything else that you want to be connected to, whether that's content or people or whatever, and then you're stuck with whatever they vertically integrate with?
Yeah, it's funny. This exchange is a masterclass in privacy people talking to people who think more about competition. So my claims
again.
my claims are not at all about kind of whether it'll be siloed or not, or whether it will be, walled garden or not. I actually agree with you. I think it will be walled garden, and we're gonna have a big fight between, a couple of market players, and someone's gonna probably win. My argument was, if you have a muscular regulator at that moment saying you have to redesign your service to do less of this, the company can no longer claim, well, that's really expensive. They can claim all sorts of other objections to it, like speech First Amendment, but they can no longer say, no, I wasn't thinking of people rolling their own LLMs and, running the llama model on their laptop. I don't think that's a reality. Moxie Marlinspike has this lovely thing about blockchain where he's like, we all want a provider to give us a fun UI to use these services. I think the same will go for large language models as well, sadly, right?
Okay, we have time for one more question. Should we throw it to the always controversial Matt Stoller? No pressure.
All right, so I have more a troll than a question.
Why am I not surprised?
I have a question, but I want to start with a troll. So I guess one point about LLMs being everywhere. I mean, if you're going to put $500 billion into this model and into these, then it kind of has to be everywhere, or else we've laid $500 billion on fire for for Super Clippy.
Yeah. Super Clippy.
So I would just note that, saying, oh, well, if you want traffic, you have to give us our content for free, or you don't get the traffic, doesn't sound like a complicated question. It just sounds like coercion. But I have and I think it gets to a fundamental problem, an intellectual problem that we have, which is that there's been a dense and rich conversation around conflicts of interest around advertising in media for 150 years, right? How do we handle the fact that advertisers have an interest in what the media outlet says? And there are lots of ways to handle that question. Lots of, I don't think there's ever been a consensus on the right way to deal with it, but there are some broad theories. I'm not sure that there's been any sort of similar conversation among communication apparatus, and certainly not among algorithms, whether advertising provides a fundamental conflict of interest and causes people to promote antisocial products. So I wonder, how do you think about whether there is a fundamental conflict of interest with the purveyors of these algorithms and LLMs?
And you mean with advertising in particular? I want to make sure I'm.
Yes, in advertising
Yeah.
as a funding model.
I mean, can I just give it a shot here? Because I just feel like capitalism is also fundamentally not in the public interest. And so that is why we have constraints. And so I think you add constraints to a system to make it serve the public interest is sorry, I'm getting a little too broad here. But
Can I
Okay,
just
so let
respond?
me make it less abstract.
okay.
We never had advertising funding telephone systems. We've had capitalism and people paid fees to use telephone systems. They didn't get advertising.
We're,
You know,
we're
so
both we're
that's-
both looking at. I mean, it depends on your silo, but we've been talking about this in the privacy community for 20 years, right? And so the ISPs, the telcos, they all have been doing deep packet inspection and more advertising all the time. And then you've got we've been having.
Come on, that's new.
conversation.
Like, take the question seriously,
But
right?
to take the question
I don't know.
seriously,
I mean, should I use a British accent?
to
I
take
thought
the
it was.
question.
No, I thought
mean,
it was.
No, they've been mimicking this new model of communication. You
No,
go
but
back.
I mean, like, if you look at Zuboff and surveillance capitalism and, Julie Cohen in Between Truth and Power, I think that doesn't mean that antitrust scholar, I don't know if you're an antitrust scholar, are having this conversation.
But Paul, there is a fundamental mismatch in how these systems operate and how the people who control them talk about them. And so I to take the question seriously, something that so I spent 2 years like reading source code and patents for algorithms. And when you do that, the thing that stands out is the business model drives the algorithm. So if a platform advertises, fundamentally it sells advertising in a duration-based way, they have a duration-based algorithm. If they sell advertising on a click-through model, they have an engagement-based algorithm. So algorithms serve business goals. This is not surprising, right? But you also then have people who run these platforms who talk about their public mission, about how they're there to serve people. And they're not. If they're serving people, they're serving people for dinner to advertisers. And so I think that's where, if there is a mismatch, that is the mismatch.
On the record, I did not think I was disrespecting you. I'm sorry you heard it that way. Come talk to me. Maybe your question confused me, but let's talk during the break. I'd appreciate it.
Okay, guys, we will end it as we are all being served to dinner. Wait to the platforms. Is that what's happening here? So thank you very much. And thank you guys for sticking with it. The late afternoon.